7 p.m. So we'll go ahead and get started on time. I just want to say good evening and welcome to everyone. Thank you for coming to our Civics 101. Today we're talking about understanding the assault on the Capitol. This year we're featuring a different topic every month geared towards helping us better understand our democracy and how to engage as citizens and community members. You can find any future session listed under our events page on the library's website at jocolibrary.org. If you have questions along the way, feel free to ask them in the chat. We're gonna lock it down so it's not distracting unless Professor Vonamy calls for questions. You can direct them directly to Colleen. Colleen, will you wave just so people know who they're sending their questions to? You also don't have to ask them publicly. If you just feel shy, you can ask Colleen too, and she'll make sure it gets asked. And also, I just want to say, we know that these are contentious events and times, but please remember to be respectful at all times during this program. I'm sure that won't be an issue, but just a reminder. And then finally, I want to welcome our speaker, Dr. Greg Vonamy. He is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science. His research examines elections, voter participation, state politics, and policy. Thank you, and let's just get started.
All right, sounds good. And thank you, Ashley, for putting this all together. And thank you all for being here tonight. We'd actually planned on doing this forum for next Thursday on federalism. It's something that we talked about 3 weeks ago, and then events sort of transpired to move up our timeline and shift our focus. But if anybody really has a deep-seated interest in the intricacies of federalism or different levels of government, I'm also happy to answer questions about that. My little sister also indicated that she was going to sign up for this event. She is a real doctor, so if any of you have any real questions, you can feel free to interject medical questions as well, and we'll have her jump in to help people in a different way. On my way in, while I was driving to be here, NPR had an interview with the director of counterintelligence for the U.S. And he made the observation that in today's society, nobody can say anything in the country in an authoritative way that more than half of the people will believe. So hearing that before we come to an event like this, I almost called Ashley and said, oh yeah, we should just call the whole thing off. We're too polarized for this to make any difference. When you're trying to say something hopefully authoritative that has some meaning to people. But as I thought more about it, it's thinking about my experiences in the classroom. If that means half the people can take something away from it, then that's maybe a glass half full situation. But certainly, I'm grateful to have the chance to be here with all of you, and I welcome your thoughts and comments. I'll try to keep my remarks brief so we can turn it over to Q&A and talk about any questions or concerns that you all have about the circumstances that we all find ourselves in. So there are a couple of things that I wanted to touch on. So first was just a perspective on the immediate political and security situation that we face in the wake of the not historically unprecedented siege on the Capitol, but very unusual. We've had maybe 2 circumstances in our nation's history that have been similar. There were early raids on Congress in the early 18th century that had at times forced Congress to flee. Those were mainly tax raids. There was also an assault by the British on Congress in the War of 1812. But since then, and that's sort of the historical time frame for how far back we need to reach into our nation's history to find something as comparable as to what we saw last Wednesday, to find anything similar to the kind of security breach that we saw in our nation's government. That was obviously, it was not an accident that it happened last Wednesday. That was designed for that particular day. That was the day that Congress was meeting to certify the Electoral College vote. That is at this point largely a formal step in our method of choosing the president, just certifying the Electoral College vote. Even though the intent was to disrupt and potentially halt that, it was only momentarily successful. So Congress was able to certify the Electoral College vote. That is the final step in the presidential election process. So that is now done. There are no further steps. There are no further counts. The Electoral College process has run its course. There is nothing further to disrupt. The next most significant day that we're looking towards is inauguration. Inauguration is when President-elect Biden will actually be sworn in and we'll see the formal transition of power. That's sort of the next most significant date in the process, and where there's a lot of attention around securing the nation's capital for Inauguration Day. The good news is part of the story, a large part of the story that we saw on January 6th was the Capitol Police, was our nation's security forces being unprepared, underestimating the threat and being unprepared for the size and aggression of the threat that they faced. There is very little evidence that that's going to happen again. There are much more robust security measures and precautions being put in place to secure our nation's capital and to secure the transfer of power on Inauguration Day on the 20th. So that's some good news. There's also a question about what this means for Congress and security around Congress. So Congress is continuing to meet. We'll talk a little bit about impeachment. Impeachment is part of the congressional process. There is also much greater security today inside Congress. There have also been some threats to our state legislatures, which are just in the early days of convening their sessions. There's also much more robust security measures around Congress, our state legislatures, and the institutions of government. So in a way, we can feel much better about the security situation that we face today than we did maybe the day of and the day after the siege on the Capitol. We still don't know exactly the extent of the security threat that we face. There are ongoing reports about chatter and organization through social media, which could portend future uprisings, future violence. There's also potentially at least two trajectories that we could see regarding the security threat that we face. On the one hand, a lot of attention is focused around the mass siege and the mass security breach at the nation's capital. That's largely a question of sort of crowd control, riot control. We have better structures and better apparatus in place. We have more effective means of dealing with that than other potential security threats. There have also been threats of potential assassinations, of potential bombings. That really leads to a different kind of threat, a more terroristic threat. That speaks to a more elusive and a more difficult threat for our nation's security forces to deal with. So we're not sure which direction the uprisings, the insurrection might go. We're not exactly sure of the scale and nature of the threats we face, but that's sort of the landscape as it looks right now. There's also a lot of political fallout from the events. The siege, the attack on the Capitol was immediately precipitated by a speech that the president delivered to the organization, to the protest that moved from near the White House grounds to Capitol Hill. There was also a more long-term foundation surrounding the allegations around Stop the Steal and conspiracism and conspiracy theories relating to misconduct and tampering with the election. So that's the political groundwork around the siege. President Trump was impeached yesterday by the House of Representatives. That is only the fourth time in our nation's history that a president has been impeached. These are very rare. It's the second time in the last year and a half that it's happened, but only the fourth time in our nation's history that a president has been impeached. President Trump was impeached by the House of Representatives on one article that was inciting an insurrection against the government. The next step in that process is it will go to the Senate. And the Senate reportedly will begin a trial on January 19th to determine whether or not President Trump is guilty of inciting an insurrection. This impeachment proceeding will be a little bit different from the others. Typically, what is at stake in a Senate trial is the removal of a federal official from office. President Trump will have already transferred power. He will no longer be president. What could still be at stake is a person that is convicted of an impeachable offense is no longer eligible to hold federal office. So if the Senate convicts President Trump of inciting an insurrection that would disqualify him from holding any future office in the U.S. Impeachment is one of two mechanisms to remove a president. There's a second mechanism in the fourth part of the 25th Amendment. The 25th Amendment is a potentially faster way of removing a president and transferring power to the vice president of the United States. That's a different process. It doesn't directly involve Congress. That invoking the 25th Amendment is done by the vice president and a majority of the cabinet. If the vice president and a majority of the cabinet deem the president as unfit to fulfill the obligations of his office, they can notify Congress of their decision, and that immediately transfers power to the vice president. There are some other steps to that process, so the president has an opportunity to say to Congress, no, I actually am fit to serve as president and fulfill the obligations, and then there's an opportunity for the vice president to respond. So there is more to the 25th Amendment. So far at this point, Vice President Mike Pence has said he does not plan to invoke the 25th Amendment, but it's something that should there be future uprisings or incitement to violence, it's not something that Vice President Mike Pence has completely taken off the table pending future decisions, pending future conduct of President Trump. But that's a different and potentially faster way of removing a president should that need to be done or should that be warranted in a very short timeline. That can be done in the timeline of hours rather than days and weeks, which is sort of the time scale for impeachment proceedings. So that's sort of the short-term situation that we face as a result of the siege and as a result of the uprising. There are some more medium and long-term consequences that we face. So some of it has to do with the polarization of our society. Our society is deeply divided between Republicans and Democrats. This is not an immediate or new phenomenon. This is not just specific to Donald Trump or even the last 10 years. The polarization of our society is something that political scientists have documented beginning at least since the 1980s. And it's been a fairly steady march in terms of Republicans and Democrats in our society becoming more distrustful and more suspicious of one another. Certainly that's the events of the last few weeks have not done anything to lessen the divide in our society. And there's questions about whether or not this violence is an aberration. Is this just a protest that got out of hand? Is this specific to the Stop the Steal movement that has gotten too extreme? Or is this a harbinger of how this distrust, how this polarization will manifest itself going forward? In the context of polarization, there's a slightly different concept of radicalization that's also a piece to the story. Radicalization has more to do with really extreme, really fringe elements of our society. There have been a number of intelligence reports going back several years that have sounded the alarm against growing radicalization in the US, where we could be facing increased domestic terrorism threats, in addition to sort of a peaceful, if unpleasant, degree of polarization in our society. And then the third piece, which is maybe a little bit more hopeful in those regards in the context of polarization, in the context of radicalization. One potential lesson that our elites might take away from these events is that there's a context in which extreme rhetoric and polarization is a useful political strategy. So if you want to run for office, if you want to win, if you want power, how do you get there? How do you win elections? There's a context in which extreme rhetoric and polarization can help you. You can run negative ads, you can vilify and demonize your opponent, primarily as a way of mobilizing your supporters. That can be electorally advantageous. There's also a context in which that's detrimental. And that's potentially one of the positive lessons that we might see elites taking away from these circumstances. If you look at the political fortune, the political outlook, what type of capital, what type of cost has President Trump incurred as a result of this? He's lost a number of allies in Congress. So for example, if you just look at the Electoral College vote certification, President Trump going into that process was looking at maybe getting around 10 to 12 Republicans voting with him. They were never going to overturn the Electoral College vote. That was never in the cards. But the question was, how many votes would he get from senators raising objections, expressing doubt about the Electoral College? After the siege, after the uprising, that number easily cut in half. There were a number of senators that looked like almost certainly they would vote with President Trump that opted not to. In the following days, a number of advisors, a number of cabinet officials, including the transportation secretary, who is the wife of the Senate Majority Leader, resigned from the White House, largely in response to President Trump, precipitating the siege on Capitol Hill. And in recent days, the most recent polls have come out about President Trump's approval. Depending on the poll, it looks like he's lost about 5 to 10% off his presidential approval, which again may not seem that significant in the context of an uprising, but for that to take place in the course of days, portends a real loss of political capital for President Trump. Some of his allies in Congress, in particular, Senator Hawley, who's one of the Missouri senators, Ted Cruz, a senator from Texas as well, who supported President Trump's effort to cast down on the Electoral College, have also seen a significant drawdown of their political status and their political capital in the Senate. So we may also be at this point, we may be in this space where political elites are reevaluating the extent to which they use extreme rhetoric, to which they act as polarization entrepreneurs to divide society for political gain, and it might be increasingly seen as a political liability. All right, so I mentioned to Ashley that I'd keep my remarks short and aim for something around 10 minutes, and as I turned my 10 minutes into about 20 minutes, I'm happy to go on talking, but let me pause here and see if there are specific questions or concerns that people have about any of these processes, security questions, institutional political questions about where we are or where we're going.
Okay, so we've got one that was kind of back in the beginning. Do both the House and Senate certify the election?
Yes. So the way the process works is the House and the Senate initially meet in a joint session of Congress. And then members of the House and members of the Senate have the opportunity to raise objections state by state to the electors chosen by those states. If they do, and they usually don't, so typically this is a formal part of our process. We've done this in every presidential election going back to 1789. But this is largely a formal process. So effectively, once the votes are counted on a state-by-state basis, and we know how the Electoral College votes are apportioned, that's the real meaningful election for president. Everything underneath that is at this point largely formal. The last time it's mattered is the election of 1876, when there were real questions around the validity of some of the electors chosen. But yes, the formal process is the House and the Senate approve the electors. If they object, the House and the Senate then meet as separate bodies to decide whether or not to certify the electors from every individual state.
Okay, and then we have one, does impeachment have any specific consequences other than handing it over to the Senate, where they take the further actions of the debate/votes for removal from office and prevention from being elected to future federal office?
Impeachment itself has no direct institutional consequences. So, if you're President Trump right now, you have the same institutional position, the same status, the same rights, the same responsibilities, the same everything. Should the Senate vote to remove him, then there is no appeals process beyond that. If the Senate votes to remove a president or any official, they're just gone. That's the first consequence of conviction. The second consequence of conviction is that they are prohibited from holding federal office at any point in the future. If the Senate decides not to convict the president for whatever reason, it is a high bar in the Senate. So impeachment, step one, just requires a majority of the House of Representatives. Step two, convicting a federal official requires 2/3 of the Senate to remove the president. That's a high bar. If you look at the political composition of the Senate right now, or at the time of a trial, there will be 50 Democrats and 50 Republicans. Assuming all 50 Democrats vote to convict President Trump, which they probably will, that would mean that they would need 17 Republicans to agree to convict President Trump, a member of their own party. We've never removed a president from office through the impeachment process. We got close with Andrew Johnson, but the most recent impeachments of President Trump and President Clinton never got especially close to the 67 votes in the Senate to remove them. But to answer the specific question, no, there's no institutional consequence of being impeached alone. There is a potential political consequence. There is a potential historical stigma around being an impeached president. And President Trump is now the first president to be impeached twice. So there may be a political, there may be a historical consequence to the impeachment.
Okay. If President Trump is convicted in the Senate, does he also lose Secret Service protection, pension, presidential library support, and other presidential perks?
That is a good question. Not one that I know the answer to. So yes, I'm not sure, so how that could potentially affect his benefits. Now, President Trump is the wealthiest president that we've ever had, so he'll be fine. So I don't think if he loses his pension, he'll be suffering in any particular way, shape, or form. Yeah, I mean that's a good question, right? So, but unfortunately not one that I know the answer to.
Okay, just a couple more. Regarding deep political divides, wasn't there a significant division between both parties during Lincoln's administration and in the early 1870s during the Paris Commune?
Yes, and that's one of the interesting things that well, it's interesting to political scientists. And since somebody asked, I'll assume it's interesting to at least one other person. If you look at the history of polarization and the history of division, it was very high, obviously during Lincoln's administration and in the immediate years. In the aftermath of the Civil War, when half the country seceded from the country and hundreds of thousands of Americans killed one another during a civil war. Yes, that was a time of very heightened polarization. We were very divided at that time. If you look at the trajectory of polarization, so it was very high during and in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. It then declined since then. So it declined after that. So it remains somewhat high, but not quite as high through the late 19th and early 20th century. And then we saw a significant drop. So we saw a significant period of depolarization in the mid 20th century, from about sort of the 1930s to the 1980s. And since the 1980s, we've seen an increase in polarization since then. One of the interesting questions for political scientists and maybe for society more broadly is, depending on the measure of polarization, our society is more polarized today than at any time since right after the Civil War, which is kind of astonishing if you think about it in that historical context, because so it's interesting in that regard. It's maybe troubling in that regard that we are so polarized, but that has also coincided with a smaller public agenda. So if you look at my public agenda, I mean the things we fight very intensely over them. We're very deeply divided as a society. Then you step back and you say, what are we divided over? What exactly are we fighting about? If you look at the significant issues before Congress, so one of the most significant issues that Congress has decided, one of the most divisive issues has been whether or not the top marginal income tax bracket should be 35% or 39.5%, which, I mean, I'm not saying that's nothing, but if you look at that in a historical context, I mean, that's not segregation. That's not women's suffrage or the Cold War, or whether or not we should fight the Nazis who had overrun France, or child labor, or any of the other significant fights that we've gone through, where we were, by those measures, less deeply divided and less deeply polarized. So it's one of those strange things that, as we've talked about less, as the issues have gotten smaller, our fights have gotten worse and more intense. To the point now, sometimes I liken this to if it's roommates or a married couple, depending on who you are and where you're at in your life, it may make more or less sense. People that just fight intensely over things nobody else cares about. And by some analysis, by some perspective, that's kind of where we are as a society. And this is not to say that there aren't important issues before our country. There are obviously important issues before our country. But in that historical context, it's easy to find issues that are more important, that are seemingly more divisive, that we were able to manage, that we were able to resolve and move forward as a society than anything we face today.
Okay. And what is the likelihood of violence in Kansas or Missouri's capital?
So yeah, and that's kind of the other unknown that I had coming in. Just it's kind of where people are at with this. It's been challenging even for political scientists. A lot of times, so we'll get requests to do these talks and appearances and sort of help walk people through things, and oftentimes that's a pretty easy lift for us. Typically there's a wealth of historical examples that we can draw from to sort of organize things and make sense of things. That's not the case here. So, when I open this and I say, we really have to go back, to the early 19th century to find anything even remotely comparable to this, we're kind of in uncharted waters here, and they're uncharted and tumultuous and potentially hostile and violent waters, which is a little bit unsettling. So take all of this with a particularly big grain of salt. Literally a week ago, Ashley and I were, what can we say about federalism? So maybe I'll be back in February and we'll talk about how we pick up the remaining pieces of the democratic institutions that we have left, or, maybe everything will be fine and we'll all be getting along and we'll wonder what we were all worrying about. The range of, I was thinking of what could possibly surprise me at this point in American politics. I think Bigfoot taking Joe Biden hostage and holing up in the Yukon Territory might do it. But otherwise, it's really the range of options, the range of outcomes are really quite large. So I would say, and I appreciate there are probably people on this call that maybe have connections, that maybe work in Jeff City or maybe Topeka, where it touches them in a personal way, or people they know are connected to. I don't think it's likely. I wouldn't lose any sleep over it. So I obviously don't work at the state capitals in Topeka or Jeff City or anywhere else. I wouldn't lose any sleep over it. I wouldn't worry about it too much. I would say it's worth being especially attentive to things, be attentive to your surroundings. And if you see something concerning, I think it's certainly worth reaching out to police or state authorities. But that's the way I understand this. I'd say the most significant threat is in the nation's capital. The next level of threat, I'd say there's a modest threat of political violence in the nation's capital. And when I say modest, I mean this is in an American context, when usually that threat of domestic violence is negligible. So to even say it's modest is a significantly different situation than we usually see ourselves in. I'd say there's a heightened threat in the state capitals. In terms of cities or elsewhere, I'd say that threat is fairly low. So if you're talking, well, what about Johnson County communities? What about the Kansas City community? I'd say that threat is fairly low.
Okay, just one more for now, and then we'll let you keep going with your presentation. As part of the fallout from the attack on the Capitol, we have seen tech companies like Twitter and Facebook crack down on voices on the right. Can you speak to concerns of the constitutionality of these actions? Are First Amendment rights being violated if the language being suppressed has been proven to incite violence?
So so I was trying to count the layers to that question. I'll say three. There may be, I may do a Rick Perry moment here, and I mean that's the risk. There are 7 layers to that. And by the time I get to 2, I forget everything else I was going to say. So to the immediate question, to the immediate First Amendment question, is there a First Amendment concern there? No. And the reason there's not a First Amendment concern there is because Twitter, Facebook, Parler, Google, Amazon, whoever, Apple, whatever, they're private companies. They're kind of off doing their own thing. And if I go on Twitter and I call the Twitter CEO a jerk or whatever, he can boot me off, and that's kind of the way the cookie crumbles. I may not like it, but do I have constitutional recourse? No. Now, if I called, I don't know, let's say I called Governor Parson a jerk, and he said, "Oh, I'm going to fire you," that could potentially raise a First Amendment question, because that is a government act. And if I don't know if Mike Parson's on this call, I don't think he's a jerk, but hypothetically, if I said that, there could not be official governmental repercussions against you for that. So that would be a government entity suppressing my speech. And the First Amendment, there's sort of a story behind that too. The First Amendment applies to all levels of government. The freedom of speech applies to the federal government, state and local government. So that is a protected, so free speech is a protected right from government interference, not from private interference. So, your friends might stop talking to you, companies might boot you off the platforms. That's kind of all fair game from the standpoint of the Constitution. There is an aspect to that to where I think a lot of times when people talk about free speech, they talk about free speech less in terms of the constitutional sense, and more because the free speech is also, so it is part of the Constitution. It's one of the most important parts of the Constitution, but it's also something that we have internalized as an American political value, where outside of what our constitutional obligations are, we also have a sense that we're better off, we're stronger as a society if we extend others a degree of respect to let them say what they want to say without undue pressure, undue influence, or maybe forms of social or economic bullying. We may be entitled to do those things, and we are entitled to do those things, but we also have a cultural sense that it's sort of wrong to do that. That it's part of our American value to respectfully disagree with each other, even when the alternative point of view might be something extreme, might be something that we find ourselves to be morally, politically, or socially reprehensible. That's a cultural value. Cultural values are subject to change. They're subject to evolution, and they're not something that are publicly regulated. So it's not something that you're going to go to a court and say, well, somebody was mean to me. They only decide legal issues. There was also part of the question that asked about violence. If you read the First Amendment, it sounds absolute. So there shall be no restrictions on free speech. Even though the Constitution reads as if it's absolute, none of our civil liberties, and the freedom of speech is potentially the most protected and most important civil liberty, none of them are absolute. So the Supreme Court and lower federal courts have recognized exceptions to all of our civil liberties, including the freedom of speech. The exception that pertains to violence is the exception to that is clear, and there's it's what's called clear and present danger doctrine. So any form of speech that presents a clear and present danger to public safety is not a protected form of speech. So the classical example is yelling fire in a crowded building. So you can't go to a crowded building and yell fire if there's not a fire. If there's a fire, tell people. But if there's not, you can't do that deliberately to incite a panic that could get people hurt. I mean, you can do that, but there will be consequences for that. And when there are consequences for that, legal consequences for that, you can't claim that it's your First Amendment right to incite hazards to public safety. All right. So I'll leave it there for now. I know there was also an aspect to that if people want to dig into that, you know, sort of about what it means, because there's also it's also politically consequent, right? So there's a political asymmetry to this, where especially a lot of conservative voices are feeling targeted by big tech. That they think big tech companies are specifically not just out to get extreme voices, but out to get extreme right voices in particular. So there's an asymmetry around that. I guess the other thing I'd add from the standpoint of big tech, like if I'm Twitter or Facebook or something like that, you know, I'm not worried at all about running afoul of First Amendment grounds. Like, I mean, nobody's going to say you can't do that because of the First Amendment. I might be a little bit more worried about antitrust action. So there has been for years some agitation. Antitrust action is just federal laws prohibiting companies from getting too big, too strong, and disallowing competition. So the federal government does intervene in the economy to break up especially unduly large corporations. There has been some agitation in Congress around potentially pursuing antitrust action against large tech corporations. It hasn't gone far. So, you know, it's like, I don't think Google or Twitter or Facebook, I don't think they're losing any sleep over it yet. But it is one of those things that the politics of that, you know, could potentially align in ways that could lead to congressional action on antitrust and anti-monopolistic grounds that could impact the operations of large tech corporations. And in some ways, it's combined. There's sort of this emerging coalition of Republican and Democratic voices scrutinizing the role of big tech in our society.
Did you, we do have a couple more questions, but we can, if you just wanted to go ahead and go on with your presentation, we can catch up with those at the end.
Oh no, let's, you know, I welcome questions. I'm happy to be here to help address questions and concerns.
Okay. The next one is, what do you think about changes to the Electoral College system?
Yeah, so there's a clear path and then a less clear path. And that's something that I think that's a discussion that we'll have. I don't know what the timeline for that discussion is. It's not right now. And I think it's not right now because the situation still seems so volatile. It just seems like there's bigger fish we have to fry right now. You know, what sense do we make of a siege against the Capitol? What sense do we make of a president seeming to encourage this insurrection? So, I mean, those are sort of big questions, big, immediate, pressing questions. Once we're past the crisis, and I hope I'm not tempting the universe there and saying that we will get past the crisis. I think there is a question that we'll have about the Electoral College. And the politics of that will be interesting. Typically, Republicans have defended the Electoral College because the Electoral College tends to favor them politically. They do better with the Electoral College than they do with the popular vote. At the same time, we have this situation where primarily it's congressional Republicans objecting to aspects of the Electoral College process. So the politics of this in a way have kind of gotten turned upside down. And does this create an opening? Does this create a space where Democrats who have long been critical of the Electoral College find some opportunities to pick up political support from Republicans who potentially now are also questioning sort of the way we conduct elections and what our electoral system looks like? I'm skeptical that that will happen. The Electoral College is written in the Constitution. So it's part of our constitutional process. We can change it, and the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, so it doesn't matter what any other law, whether the federal law or state law says, if the Constitution establishes the Electoral College, that's what we've got. We can change the Electoral College, but doing that requires 2/3 of Congress, both the House and the Senate, to propose an amendment, and it requires 3/4 of the states to ratify the amendment. I'm going to do math in my head now, which is never a good idea. In the 232, I appreciate this is being recorded, don't cite me on that. In the 230-ish years of our nation's history, we've had 27 constitutional amendments. I will not try to divide 230 something by 27, but I mean, we see a constitutional amendment rarely. And it's not for a lack of ideas. Tens of thousands of amendments to the Constitution have been proposed. It's just that the process is so difficult just to propose an amendment, much less ratify it, that, I mean, almost certainly, as soon as somebody starts talking about amending the Constitution, like, I mean, politically, you're almost totally dead. Like, I mean, you can almost write that off. If somebody starts talking about amending the Constitution, you can safely turn your attention to almost anything else going on in society. It's more likely to happen than that. And that's 27 times. I mean, 10 of those are the Bill of Rights, which were basically a package deal with the Constitution. So after that, we had 17 amendments, and 2 of those cancel each other out. So we've had 15 effective amendments to the Constitution. And the last one was, I think, in 1992, and that's the dumbest amendment. So the last meaningful amendment we've had was like 1964. I should know that, but it's been a long time since we've had a meaningful constitutional amendment. But that's what it would take to change the Electoral College. So very unlikely to happen. I would say of the possible constitutional amendments that we could see, I'd say there may be, so it's not an imminent discussion, it's not anything likely to happen, but I mean, if I had to bet, like in my lifetime, somebody said, like let's say an alien comes down here, and says, we've traveled forward in time, and in your lifetime, there will be one constitutional amendment. Getting rid of the Electoral College, I would guess, would be one of 2 plausible amendments that I could see happen. I don't think it's likely, but there are 2 plausible amendments that I could see being added. The other one is something about campaign finance. Just because it's one of those things that among voters, the Electoral College, so there are 3 things that Americans generally agree on across party lines, generally. People don't like the Electoral College. They don't like campaign finance, and they like the death penalty. Something that Republicans and Democrats generally agree on. There aren't many things that Republicans and Democrats agree on. Those are things that Republicans and Democrats generally agree on. So electorally, there may be some support there, but I don't think you're going to get the elite support from Congress and the states to make that happen. Now, there's an interstate compact. Interstate compacts are agreements between states. There's one out there called the National Popular Vote Initiative. And what the National Popular Vote Initiative tries to do is it tries to functionally get rid of the Electoral College without actually amending the Constitution. And the way it works is the National Popular Vote Initiative group tries to persuade enough states to where they can control 270 Electoral College votes to sign on to this. And for states that sign on to it, those states agree to award their electoral college votes based not on their state vote, but on the national popular vote. So for example, if Missouri signed on, and they haven't, but let's say Missouri did, what would happen is Missouri would award their electoral college votes to Joe Biden because he won the national popular vote, rather than Donald Trump because he won the Missouri state popular vote. If they did that, if they reached that 270 vote threshold, that would effectively or functionally eliminate the electoral college and create a system of choosing the president based on the national popular vote. I think that has other political problems, but you know, that's something that's out there that I think is more plausible. So we could see something with that happen. Like I said, I don't think it would work, but that's potentially another path to change the electoral college vote process to a national popular vote mechanism of choosing the president.
Okay, I think we've just got one more question, unless anybody else comes up with anything. Is it possible that the Republican Party will split into two parties?
Yes. So parties in the US function differently. So we're already an outlier compared to most other democracies. Most other democracies have a multi-party system. And I appreciate that two parties is technically a multi-party system, but we usually talk about multi-party systems as more than two. So we're an outlier in those regards. Most countries have, and it's also true, so I know sometimes I get pushback from people who feel very deeply about their small party. So if any of you are committed American Green Party members or Libertarian Party members, this is not to ignore or overlook smaller parties in the US, but when we say two parties, we mean two electorally competitive parties. The two parties in the US control 533 seats in Congress and over 99.5% of the state legislative seats. So I mean, it is overwhelmingly a two-party system in terms of electorally competitive parties. We are unusual in those regards. Most other countries have somewhere between 5 and 10 political parties. Even countries that are much smaller and more homogenous than us have more parties than we do, even though we're much larger and much more diverse. There are reasons for that having to do with the electoral rules that we have. The electoral rules that we have are different from most other countries. They create strong incentives for us to have only two major parties. So could the Republican Party split? We have not had, so the last time we had a new party emerge, a new electorally competitive party emerge in the US, was when the Republican Party formed right before the Civil War. So the Democratic Party has been around since 1826. The Republican Party has been around since 1856, and that's, you know, they've been the only two players in the game really since then. Could they meaningfully split into a second party where we might be looking at a three-party system? Maybe. You know, there's certainly been speculation around that, you know, Donald Trump may not go the route of most ex-presidents have sort of a comfortable retirement and they'll cease to be, you know, sort of active political figures and, you know, take on charitable work or, you know, whatever else they want to do. President Trump seems unlikely to pursue that path. So he has expressed a continued interest to be a political force. Members of his family have expressed, and especially Donald Trump Jr. has expressed an interest in continuing his father's political legacy. So that's something where we could see a groundwork for a different political movement that could potentially turn into a different political party. If it happens, I anticipate that it would not happen at the national level. So for example, I don't think we'll see, well, I mean, we saw it in 1992 with Ross Perot. I mean, that was the last time we saw sort of but I mean, you know, so I mean, Ross Perot ran as an independent in 1992 for president. He got about 19% of the vote, which is great for a third-party candidate. He got skunked in the electoral college. He did not win a single electoral college vote. So, and if you can't win the electoral college vote, you're never going to be president. The last time any third-party candidate won an electoral college vote for president was 1968. And that was, I'm blanking, it was the governor of Alabama. I can't believe I'm blanking on his name. He ran on a pro-racial, George Wallace, he ran on a pro-racial segregation platform. And he was never going to win the presidency. That was a protest candidacy against the Civil Rights Act. That's the last time any non-Republican or Democratic candidate won any electoral college votes. So there was a very strong electoral pressure against there being serious third-party candidates. It could happen regionally. So we have seen in some cases, other countries that have systems like ours will have a competitive regional third party. So for example, we see this in Canada. So Canada has the Bloc Québécois, which is a Quebec nationalist party. They're only competitive in the province of Quebec. That would be something where, for example, if Donald Trump has a very strong political foothold in certain states or certain districts, he could potentially parlay that into a competitive party. And in a way, our politics are kind of aligned that way. In 2020, what we saw is that our red counties, our Republican counties, got even more red than they have been. Our blue counties, our Democratic counties have gotten even more Democratic than they have been. So as the locus of political competition shifts away from the general election and towards things like primary elections, as we become more politically homogenous, it is something where we could potentially see a space for Republicans to face off against other Republicans. I think that's most likely to manifest itself in the form of primary competition, where we could, we're in Kansas, this has kind of been the Kansas experience for decades. Kansas is kind of so it has two parties, but underneath that, it's had this division inside the Republican Party between moderate and conservative Republicans. And those two factions have competed with each other in primary elections and in the state legislature. I think insofar as we see fractioning in the Republican Party, I think it'll probably look more like that. More primary competition, maybe some more dissent in Congress where they'll take different legislative votes, maybe reach in the state legislatures as well, rather than, so I don't know, are we going to see the party of Donald Trump on the ballot? Some people might love that, some people might not. I think that's unlikely to happen for a number of electoral and political reasons.
Okay, well, that was all the questions that I have. If anybody has any, feel free to submit them to either Ashley or I.
I just got one. When counting stats for the oh, excuse me, this is not for, somebody was messaging me something else. Not a question. Anyone else have a question? I don't want anybody to not get their question answered because they're feeling shy. Okay. I think that's it then. So thank you. Oh.
All right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So
Yes.
So that's it. So if there's no other questions, I'm gonna geek out here for a second. So like I said, I don't know where everybody's at in terms of making sense of these events, making sense of where we're at as a government and as a society. So I wanted to offer a little bit more perspective on that, a little bit more political science perspective, for whatever that's worth, in two senses. So one, there's this idea of motive attribution asymmetry. It is sort of an academic concept about how we view, how we understand disagreement. So do we understand people that we disagree with as simply having a different set of experiences, a different set of perspectives, or do we view them as some sort of malevolent demonic force sent to us from the depths of hell? And how do we view people that agree with us? Do we view them as sharing similar intellectual commitments, or do we view them as sort of being on the side of benevolence and all that is good and loving in the world? What scholars have found in the US is that the level of motive attribution asymmetry between Republicans and Democrats, the level of antipathy that we feel, the sense that we have that disagreement is not motivated by a different political perspective, but rather ill will and malevolence, is similar to the level of motive attribution asymmetry between Israelis and Palestinians. That is not a context that is healthy for a democracy. And the more that we can do to draw that down, the more concerted effort. And this is something that is not in Congress. It's not in the White House. This is something that is in us. This is in our society. The more that we can do to try and understand disagreement, even that seems repugnant to us, the more that we can try to see that as coming from a place of well-meaning, the more we can do to draw down some of the antipathy that we see in our society. On potentially an easier note, I'll add that there are, so you can say, well, how concerned about this should we be? In that, how concerned for our government and society should we be? I would say modestly. Not something that I would lose sleep over. Not, yeah, like if any of you have underground bunkers, this is not a time to run to your underground bunker. It's not that bad. But there is cause for concern. It's not for nothing that you know, I actually thought we might want. It's not for nothing that we've had 43 people at this meeting in less than a week. There's real legitimate cause for concern in our society. There are, so political scientists have identified 3 factors that create a stable democracy. So if you want a stable functioning democracy, political scientists say there are 3 things and we disagree with each other about which one matters the most. But one is the institutions, says you got to have the right rules. One is the economy, so you have to have the right distribution of wealth and income in society. And the third one is the idea of civic culture, that you've got to have the right norms, you got to have the right values in society. And it's that third aspect that I wanted to leave everybody with. So if you take anything away from this talk, this is maybe the most important thing I'd like everybody to take away from the talk. This time, how we rebuild and restore that sense of civic culture. So it certainly can be high involved levels of political participation. It can be doing stuff like this, you know, where you're really deeply involved in civic engagement. You're really attentive to issues and concerns in our society. But it can also be a lot of other things. So for example, one of the major studies of the idea and importance of civic culture looked at how people participate in their communities. This is a study in Italy. The 3 most common sources of social groups that they found, the 3 most common sources of civic participation, were church attendance, soccer clubs, and choral societies, which had no direct relationship to politics. But it turns out they were really important for building communities in those societies and just having those strong communal connections, having those strong relationships, actualized their democratic institutions in those local and regional governments. So even very basic things like reaching out to neighbors, you know, you can have a Zoom call with your friends while you watch the Chiefs game on Sunday, you know, whatever it is, even if it seems like it's not political, those community building measures can be really, really important for the long-term health of our democracy. And certainly if anybody out there is saying, yeah, I'm really troubled by this, I'm worried about the future of our government and society, what can I do? Those types of things are very easy things that aren't obvious, that seem very far removed from government and society, but can have a big impact on where we go. At least if you believe political scientists, and there are 100 reasons why you shouldn't do that, but it's a positive message, so we'll run with it.
All right, thank you so much. It's Dr. Bonamy, and thank you to everyone who took time out of their evening to attend this. We think it's important, so we're so happy to see you. The recording will be made live shortly on the library's YouTube. Maybe give us a moment, for any post flubs, edit those out. But it will be available in the next few days. If you do have any questions, feel free to send them my way. I'm happy to help you, or direct them to Dr. Bonamy if he is so willing to follow up with you. Thank you again.